After 14 years in government, the British Conservative Party has been roughly thrown out of office like they were being shaken off a beach towel. And when your beaches have more pebbles than sand, that hurts. They have been reduced to their lowest number of seats in a century as Labour turned the electoral map red.
As Big Ben strikes 10, the exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
It's the end of a tumultuous period in British politics, one that started with the slash and burn of David Cameron and George Osborne's austerity plans.
Why is our economy broken?
To the massive gamble on the Brexit referendum.
The British people have spoken and the answer is, we're out.
Right.
Then 3 years of divorce negotiations with Europe.
Brexit means Brexit.
It's this Prime Minister to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
There was the circus of Boris Johnson.
It is a stitch-up.
Christ, can you get me a rope? Hasta la vista, baby.
And the sideshow of Liz Truss, whose legacy will likely be the title of shortest-serving British Prime Minister.
In December, I'll be in Beijing, opening up new pork markets.
By the time Rishi Sunak came to power, it seemed like there was nothing that could save the Tories.
With recent opinion polls giving Labour a 30-point lead.
In a country that lives for drama, the last 14 years have been like a soap opera.
She gets a bling and I get the booby prize.
And in that long lineup of bad decisions, missteps, distractions,
Thank you.
and atrocious dancing, there is one person who is more responsible than the rest. I'm Matt Bevan, and today on If You're Listening, we'll try to answer the question, who broke Britain?
Because I have nothing to say about this matter except obviously tea.
So, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is the new Prime Minister, and he's got a lot to get on with. He's promised to unwind a lot of the Conservative Party's agenda, but there's one thing he needs to do urgently. Cancel a bunch of flights to Rwanda. See, the Tories' final catastrophic policy was a madcap scheme based on a Hail Mary play that worked in Australia 21 years ago. It's a story that really tells you a lot about why the Tories lost so badly. And the story starts in the Indian Ocean.
An Australian Coast Watch aircraft spotted an internationally recognised distress signal.
It was August 2001, and a small fishing boat was stranded in the middle of the sea.
Believed to be an SOS painted on the Indonesian vessel.
On board were hundreds of asylum seekers on their way to seek refuge in Australia.
Like a good Samaritan on the high seas, the captain of the Norwegian freighter Tampa rescued 430 mostly Afghani refugees from their sinking ship.
If you're Australian, you probably already know where this story is going. If you're not Australian, buckle up. See, the asylum seekers picked up by the Tampa wanted to go to Australia, but Australia wanted them to go back to Indonesia.
Mr. Speaker, the government has requested the Tampa not enter Australian territorial waters and that it should continue on its original route to Indonesia.
Everyone agrees that having criminal smugglers pack hundreds of asylum seekers onto small fishing boats that often sink is something that needs to be stopped. But there was little agreement about how to stop it. Prime Minister John Howard's Conservative coalition was predicted to lose the next federal election. Far-right party One Nation had whipped up anti-immigration sentiment, and the government was under pressure to do something about it.
I don't think the coalition can win the government election unless they get a reasonable flow of preferences from One Nation.
He made a decision. The asylum seekers would not come to Australia.
Not in Australia.
Or go to Indonesia. Some would go to New Zealand and...
The tiny island nation Nauru in the Central Pacific will process the rest of those on board at Australia's expense.
Nauru. I could do a whole series about Nauru, but they really needed the money.
Less than 12,000 people live there. Drinking water is scarce and medical services limited.
And in exchange for taking the asylum seekers, Australia provided a lot of money.
I would think that it's going to cost a lot of money, far more than keeping the people in Australia while their claims are assessed and determined.
Within a month, Howard rolled out legislation saying anyone who attempted to enter Australia on a boat would be sent to Nauru or Papua New Guinea for processing. And even if they were found to be genuine refugees, they would not be allowed to settle in Australia.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
It was called the Pacific Solution, and politically, it worked.
I think we're actually now in a position where we can stick our necks out a little and call this result.
The coalition has a majority of 10 seats.
The Conservative coalition government won an election that nobody thought they were going to win. All of this made big news around the entire world, including in the country that is the undisputed champion of sending people it doesn't want into detention in distant places, the United Kingdom. Several 100,000 people live in the UK illegally. Most come into the country on a work, student or tourist visa and then just don't leave. However, many come into the country without a visa, seeking asylum, but not on little boats. Since the 1990s, there's been a much easier way of getting from Europe to England.
They're through, hey! There's the handshake we've all been waiting for. The Channel Tunnel is a symbol of change. Vive la France!
Most asylum seekers enter Britain hidden in vehicles going from France to England through the Channel Tunnel, or in trucks carried on ferries. This has periodically led to horrific tragedies as migrants suffocate inside the back of lorries.
Inside one vehicle, 58 bodies and 2 survivors, suspected illegal immigrants.
British governments of both parties have attempted to stop people crossing the Channel with increased security on both sides and periodically deporting people whose asylum applications are denied. The EU helps the UK by stopping people from even reaching the French side of the Channel, let alone trying to cross it. But in the last few years, 2 massive things have changed. Firstly, Britain isn't in the EU anymore, thanks to a campaign led by Boris Johnson, which promised to
take back control of our borders with a sensible, fair and impartial system.
And secondly, extra security measures at the Channel Tunnel and ferry terminals have actually started to work. But of course, now that they're not coming through the tunnel, the migrants are getting on boats. In 2018, a couple hundred people attempted to cross the Channel on small boats. In 2019, it was nearly 2,000. In 2020, it was more than 8,000. In 2021, it was 28,000. So in 2022, Boris Johnson's government, dissatisfied with the lack of cooperation from Europe, started to look at the Australia model for solutions.
We will stop those who come here illegally making endless legal claims to remain in our country, at the expense of the British public.
They did a deal with the tiny African nation of Rwanda. The UK would pay them hundreds of millions of pounds and Rwanda would take the asylum seekers off their hands.
The deal we've done is uncapped, and Rwanda will have the capacity to resettle tens of thousands of people in the years ahead.
By this stage, Boris Johnson, who had led the Tories to a landslide victory in 2019, was wildly unpopular. After lying about it for quite a while, he admitted that actually, yes, he had been getting his party on at Downing Street after ordering the entire population of Britain into COVID lockdown. Much like John Howard in 2001, Johnson looked to be leading his party towards inevitable election defeat.
We must find a way to stop these boats now.
He said this was all about preventing people from drowning at sea and stopping human trafficking.
So, we must halt this appalling trade and defeat the people smugglers.
And the way to do that was to copy John Howard's plan. Everybody who comes by boat goes to Rwanda. Nobody wants to go to Rwanda, ergo, nobody gets on a boat. It's a deterrent.
We will do whatever it takes to deliver this new approach.
But he had a problem. The UK is a signatory of the European Convention on Human Rights, which had already in the past prevented British authorities from deporting people to unsafe countries. Rwanda is a country which was in the midst of a genocide 30 years ago. It has poor systems for processing asylum seekers and a history of deporting people to their country of origin, even if they are likely to be persecuted there. So Rwanda is unsafe. Can't send anyone there. Unless you say this.
Rwanda is one of the safest countries in the world, globally recognised for its record on welcoming and integrating migrants.
Okay, so Rwanda is safe? In that case, it's not really a deterrent, is it? Johnson foresaw this issue.
We expect this will be challenged in the courts.
And it was, immediately. The government was left in a paradox. They had to convince the courts that Rwanda is a great place, but they had to convince asylum seekers that Rwanda sucks. Meanwhile, they had to convince British voters that a few 100,000 migrants travelling on boats were a serious threat, and convince them that the government had it all under control. None of that worked. The courts intervened and stopped the first plane from deporting failed refugees to Rwanda. To try and convince voters that they were doing something, the British government hired a barge called the Bibi Stockholm and began housing hundreds of asylum seekers on board.
This 3-storey ship that can accommodate 500 people has been compared to the notorious prison ships used to house convicts in the Victorian era.
At a cost of tens of millions of pounds. The rate of boat arrivals increased, and the polls kept getting worse for the Tories. Less than 3 months after announcing the policy, Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister under the weight of several swirling scandals. The Rwanda plan was someone else's problem now. In the lead up to the 2024 election, the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was left in a tricky situation. With polls indicating that his party was headed for an electoral wipeout, he had to decide what issues to campaign on to try and save as many seats as possible. It wasn't as though the Conservative Party had no achievements to tout during the coming election campaign. During their 12 years in government, they had legalised same-sex marriage, years before Australia did, and without a plebiscite.
I'm in favour of gay marriage because I'm a massive supporter of marriage and I don't want gay people to be excluded from a great institution.
They had led the G20 in fighting climate change.
We're announcing that we will be ending our contribution to climate change by 2050 and legislating for a net zero emissions target.
They had started construction on a high-speed rail route from London to the north of England and led the most effective COVID vaccination program in Europe. Don't make me compare them to Australia on those issues. They'd provided global leadership when it came to pushing back against Russia's attack on Ukraine, and in 2019 they had convinced millions of Labour Party voters to vote for them, often for the first time, by promising to deliver Brexit, which they then did. In October last year, at a speech to the Conservative Party in Manchester, it was time for Rishi Sunak to lay out his plan to avoid electoral catastrophe.
Now, it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce you to a wonderful, wonderful father, my best friend, and your Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
In his hour-long speech, meant to lay out his vision for the future of Great Britain, he made it clear that his vision was incredibly narrow. He promised to stop children from smoking.
I propose that in future, we raise the smoking age by 1 year every year.
He promised to slightly alter the way end-of-school tests were run.
Bring together A-levels and T-levels into a new single qualification for our school leavers.
He randomly took a potshot at trans people.
A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
He blamed the crisis in the National Health Service on the pandemic and strikes by healthcare workers.
They continue to demand massive, unaffordable pay rises.
He didn't mention climate policy. He had wound back the government's emission reduction plans weeks earlier. And the big reveal, he promised to stop building that high-speed rail project.
I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project.
He didn't offer a plan to deal with the cost of living crisis or the energy crisis or the housing crisis. He didn't mention his predecessors, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. In fact, none of them were anywhere to be seen. And then he said what may be the most extraordinary thing that I've ever heard a UK leader say.
At the next election, the choice the people face is bigger than party politics. Do we want a government committed to making long-term decisions, prepared to be radical in the face of challenges and to take on vested interests? Or do we want to stand still and quietly accept more of the same?
Sunak is the leader of a government that has been in power since 2010, offering to stop kids smoking and not build a train line. Is that being radical in the face of challenges? When it came to the challenge of asylum seekers on boats, though, he doubled down on the Rwanda plan.
Know this: I will do whatever is necessary to stop the boats.
This vision, released by the Home Office, shows border agents raiding properties across the country. Others have been bundled into vans after showing up for routine check-ins.
On the last day of April this year, a man arrived at Kigali International Airport in Rwanda on a plane from London. Rishi Sunak's government had paid him £3,000 and given him free accommodation for the next 5 years if he got on the plane and went to Rwanda. He took the deal. After 2 years and more than £500 million were spent trying to get this plan up and running, he is the only person who has been deported to Rwanda. And now that the Conservatives have lost the election, he is the only one who ever will. Labor has promised to repeal the policy. Everyone has an ideology, a way they think the world should work, a set of beliefs that guides their opinions. Sometimes it takes abandoning parts of your ideology to get elected. That's populism. But leading is something different. Leadership is knowing when your ideology isn't working, or is harming people, or making things worse, and then having the courage to abandon it. David Cameron came to power in 2010, promising to fix broken Britain. He thought his ideology, small government, would fix it. His priority was to bring down national debt by cutting government spending and increasing economic growth by encouraging people to work more. But when his austerity program began to drive millions of Britons to rely on food banks to feed their families, and saw life expectancy flatline, and saw prisons fill to bursting, and saw schools begin to crumble, he didn't waver. When his welfare cuts saw people have to leave the workforce to care for children, the elderly, or people with disabilities, when hundreds of libraries closed, when councils went bankrupt, when economic growth stagnated, he didn't have the courage to adapt. His leadership abilities were shown to be woefully inadequate when he accidentally upended 50 years of economic policy and brought about Brexit. Since then, populism has run rampant. Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have repeatedly abandoned their ideologies for the sake of staying in power. When we ask who broke Britain, the answer begins with David Cameron. The others, often blamed for Britain's decline, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson and others, only gained prominence because of Cameron's failures of leadership. Of course, they only stayed in power because of the colossal ineptitude of their opposition, who lost 4 elections in a row before finally winning one this week. And that story is next on Who Broke Britain.